So you're looking to get your head around something complex, but maybe don't want to drown in endless details.
Yeah, wading through tons of info can be tough.
Well, you've definitely come to the right place. Welcome to the deep dive.
This is where we take source material listeners send us and, really pull out the core insights.
The surprising bits, the stuff that makes it all click. And today, we are diving deep into a pretty heavy topic. The history of Vietnam's wars. A nation really defined by conflict.
That's right. It's quite a story, a relentless fight for identity, for independence, against just so many different external powers.
And internal struggles, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. We'll be looking at, everything from that incredible millennium under Chinese rule
1,000 years.
to French colonialism, the big Cold War interventions, and even the regional wars that flared up after reunification.
Okay, so our goal here isn't just like a history lecture, dates and battles.
No, no. We want to find those crucial elements.
Those unexpected facts that really show you the resilience, the adaptability of the Vietnamese people.
Yeah, understand the why, the root causes, the key moments, and what it all means long term.
And we're basing this all on a really thorough historical overview sent in by one of our listeners.
Great source material to work with.
Okay, let's jump in, starting way, way back. A very long period of outside control.
Right. Let's start with a period that really sets the stage for everything else. Over 1,000 years of Chinese domination, starting around 111 BCE.
Wow.
Yeah, so after the Han Dynasty conquered the area, the northern part of, what we now call Vietnam, it basically became part of the Chinese Empire.
Over 1,000 years, it's still kind of hard to wrap your head around that time frame under foreign rule.
Yeah.
So what did that actually look like? What did Chinese rule involve?
Well, it was definitely a time of significant cultural and technological transfer, though, under duress.
Right.
The Chinese brought in their administrative systems, Confucianism, Taoism, Mahayana Buddhism. These all took root.
And technology, too.
Yes. Advanced farming techniques, things like building dikes, irrigation systems, super important for growing rice there.
Okay, so a lot of influence coming in.
Right.
Culturally, technologically, you might think after that long they'd just become assimilated.
That's what's so striking. The historical sources are really clear on this. Despite all that influence, the Vietnamese were never able to assimilate. There were constant uprisings, frequent Vietnamese rebellions. Even when China was incredibly powerful, this distinct Vietnamese identity just persisted.
Okay, that feels like a really crucial point. This whole drive for their own identity, pushing back against outside control, it wasn't some modern thing.
Exactly. It's baked into their history, deeply embedded.
And understanding that is key to understanding the later wars, I guess.
Absolutely fundamental. It shows Vietnamese nationalism, this deep suspicion of foreign control. It's a core part of their historical DNA. Take the Trung Sisters Rebellion, for instance, around 40 CE.
Ah, yeah, I've heard of them. Trung Trac and Trung Ni. Tell us about them.
So these two sisters, they rallied the local people, actually raised an army.
Incredible.
And managed, unbelievably, to set up an independent Vietnamese state briefly.
Wow. Against the Han Empire.
Yes. Now, the Chinese eventually crushed the rebellion, but the Trung sisters, they became these hugely important figures, still are today. Potent symbols of resistance.
What courage that must have taken. Two women leading a revolt against, well, a superpower of the time.
It's remarkable. And their story still resonates so strongly.
And it wasn't just a one-off event, right? The source mentioned other resistance, too.
Definitely not. Throughout the 3rd to 6th centuries, you see lots of smaller rebellions, often sparked by Chinese officials being tyrannical, demanding forced labor, heavy taxes, that kind of thing.
So even if they were put down, the resistance kept simmering.
Constantly. It shows this underlying spirit. It wasn't just fighting either. Think about language. Even with centuries of Chinese script being used, the Vietnamese language kept its own unique sounds, its vocabulary.
That's a subtle form of resistance in itself.
It really is. Preserving those cultural markers.
Okay, so take away from this first long era, over 1,000 years of pushback against a massive neighbor really forged this deeply ingrained spirit of resistance against foreign imposition.
Exactly. That really sets the precedent for the struggles to come.
All right, let's fast forward quite a bit. New colonial power on the scene, France.
Right. So the lead up to the First Indochina War, it really starts with French colonial power getting weaker around World War II.
How so?
Well, things like the Franco-Japanese conflict, the border war with Thailand, Kind of showed France wasn't invincible anymore. It created a bit of a power vacuum after the war.
Okay, so France looks vulnerable, and stepping into that gap, Vietnamese nationalism.
Precisely. After World War II ended, France was absolutely determined to get its colonies back, including Indochina.
The times had changed.
Massively. Strong independence movements had grown. Ho Chi Minh had founded the Viet Minh back in 41. Their goal, kick out both the French and the Japanese, full independence.
And they declared independence right after the war, didn't they?
September 1945, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. A huge statement.
But the French weren't just going to pack up and leave.
Not a chance. There were some initial talks, but France basically refused to grant real independence. They wanted to reestablish control.
So a clash was inevitable.
That fundamental conflict,
Right.
French desire to rule, Vietnamese desire for independence, that's what sparked the First Indochina War. Kicked off officially December 1946.
Things seemed to escalate quickly, though. I remember reading about the Haiphong incident.
Yeah, that was really significant, a turning point. The French Navy shelled Haiphong in November 46. Thousands of civilians killed.
Terrible.
It really cemented the idea for Ho Chi Minh and the others that, a peaceful path wasn't possible. It hardened their resolve.
So the war starts. Early on, French control the cities, Viet Minh control the countryside, guerrilla warfare.
That was the initial dynamic, yeah. But the Viet Minh, under leaders like Von Ngoyen Giap, they were incredibly adaptable.
How did their tactics change?
Well, they started using artillery more effectively, ambushing French convoys, even getting anti-aircraft guns. By 1950, they weren't just guerrillas anymore. They had a proper, regular army.
And they were getting help.
Crucial support, yeah. Military, economic aid from Communist China and the Soviet Union.
Which naturally brings the U.S. into the picture more directly. Roosevelt had been anti-colonialism, but the Cold War changed things.
Dramatically. You had the communist victory in China in 49, the Soviets getting the atomic bomb same year. U.S. anxiety about communism spreading just skyrocketed.
And then Korea.
Then the Korean War breaks out in June 50. That really solidified the U.S. view that this was all part of a global communist push.
The domino theory.
Exactly. The idea that if Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would follow. So the U.S. starts pouring aid into the French effort.
Despite maybe not loving the colonial aspect.
The anti-communist angle became paramount.
Okay, and this all leads up to that major battle. Dien Bien Phu. Sounds like a real turning point.
Oh, it was absolutely decisive. The Viet Minh besieged the French fortress there. A long, brutal siege.
And the Viet Minh won.
They did. A stunning victory in 1954. It was a clear, unmistakable message. French colonialism in Indochina, it was over. Done.
Which leads to the Geneva Accords. Okay, so these recognized independence for Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, but they also split Vietnam temporarily.
Yes, temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. North under the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh. South supported by the U.S.
And crucially, it was meant to be temporary. Elections were planned for 56 to reunify the country.
That is absolutely critical. The line was explicitly called a temporary military boundary, not a political border. The Accords had a clear roadmap for reunification via elections.
But that didn't happen.
No. The U.S. and the new leader in the South, Ngo Dinh Diem, they've refused to even participate in the talks about the elections.
Why?
Their focus shifted entirely to building South Vietnam into a solid anti-communist state, basically propping it up against the North.
So the agreement designed to bring peace was, well, it was undermined almost immediately by Cold War politics.
Pretty much. And as our source material puts it, that decision held the inherent seeds of the Second Indochina War.
You can really see how one conflict just flows into the next. Breaking promises, competing ideologies.
Exactly. By 1959, the North Vietnamese leadership basically decided, okay, peaceful reunification isn't happening. Violent revolution would be necessary.
And we see that Viet Minh adaptability again, right? They'd built a real army by then.
Yes, they'd moved beyond just guerrilla tactics. They could fight conventional battles. That flexibility was going to be vital.
Okay, so the stage is set. Second Indochina War. Or, as most people in the West know it, the Vietnam War. Dominant theory still driving U.S. policy.
Very much so. U.S. support for South Vietnam just kept increasing through the late 50s and early 60s. More money, more advisors.
How many troops by the early 60s?
By 62, something like 9,000 U.S. personnel were there. Advisors, support roles, mostly.
Meanwhile, the North is backing the insurgency in the South.
Right. They supported the creation of the National Liberation Front, the NLF, or Viet Cong, in the South in 1960. Seeing reunification blocked, they step up support.
And then the flashpoint. Gulf of Tonkin, August 64.
Yeah. The alleged attacks on U.S. Navy ships, Whatever the exact details, and they're still debated, it gave President Johnson the justification he needed
To escalate.
to push Congress for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which essentially gave him a blank check to wage war in Vietnam, paved the way for full-scale American intervention.
And from there, the war escalates rapidly. Big phases, U.S. troop buildup, major offensives.
Operation Rolling Thunder bombing campaign starts. First, U.S. ground combat troops land in 65. Battles like Ia Drang Valley.
Then 66, 67, the U.S. goes on the offensive, search and destroy missions.
Trying to take the fight to the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA. But also back home, anti-war protests start picking up steam.
And then the massive turning point, 1968, the Tet Offensive.
Yeah. Militarily, the Communist forces took huge losses. The U.S. and South Vietnamese forces pushed them back.
But the impact?
The psychological and political impact, especially in the U.S., was just enormous. It was a shock.
How so?
Well, the sheer scale of the coordinated attacks, hitting cities all over South Vietnam, even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It completely shattered the official narrative that the U.S. was winning and the enemy was on the ropes.
So the media coverage played a big role.
Hugely. People saw fighting in the streets, saw the U.S. Embassy under attack. It made it crystal clear victory wasn't just around the corner. Think about those images, right? Directly contradicting what people were being told.
That must have really shaken public confidence.
It massively eroded support for the war. Led directly to Johnson deciding not to run for re-election. A huge moment.
And Nixon comes in with a new policy, Vietnamization.
Right. The idea was to gradually pull U.S. troops out and hand over the fighting to the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN.
While still providing massive air support and aid.
Oh, yeah. And expanding the war secretly. Bombing Cambodia, the incursions into Cambodia.
And the anti-war protests intensify even more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kent State, massive demonstrations. The country was incredibly divided.
So negotiations happen. Eventually, the Paris Peace Accords in 73, ceasefire, U.S. withdrawal.
Supposedly peace. But the core issues weren't resolved. The accords basically just papered over the cracks.
And it didn't last long.
No. 1975, the North launches its final big offensive. The South Vietnamese forces, without that massive U.S. support, just crumbled.
Fall of Saigon, April 30th, 1975, end of the war.
And reunification of Vietnam under communist rule.
A long, brutal war. Lots of international players involved beyond the U.S. and Vietnam.
Definitely. Soviet Union, China heavily backing North Vietnam, South Korea, Australia, others sending troops to support South Vietnam. A real Cold War proxy battleground.
And the Vietnamese strategy, that mix of guerrilla and conventional warfare, proved incredibly effective against a superpower.
It really did. They used what's called a hybrid strategy. Protracted guerrilla war, wearing down the enemy, hitting supply lines, but also capable of big conventional operations when needed.
Leveraging local knowledge, popular support.
And just incredible patience. An attritional approach. They knew they couldn't necessarily win big battles head-on all the time, but they aimed to make the war too costly, too long for the Americans.
Tet is interesting in that light. Militarily, a setback for them.
Huge losses, yes, but strategically, politically, and psychologically, a massive success. It broke the will of the American public, or at least significantly damaged it.
So the outcome. Communist victory, unified Vietnam, but the cost, staggering.
That's immense. Over 3 million people killed in total. More than half were Vietnamese civilians. 58,000 Americans.
And the physical scars? Unexploded bombs, Agent Orange?
Lingering effects even today. Birth defects, environmental damage, horrific.
And the source calls it a quintessential example of asymmetric warfare.
Absolutely. A superpower with all the technology and resources losing to a much smaller, poorer country.
Because military might wasn't enough.
Exactly. The source makes a great point. The true battlefield extended beyond conventional combat to the psychological and political fronts, especially within the U.S.
Tactical wins didn't equal strategic victory.
Right. You need political will, popular support, legitimacy. The North Vietnamese had that, or enough of it, to outlast the U.S. intervention.
And that domestic pressure in the U.S., the protests, the cost in lives and money, that directly forced policy changes.
Without a doubt. Johnson's initial balancing act, avoid defeat, but don't let the war derail his domestic plans, it just became unsustainable. Tet blew that apart.
Led to him stepping aside Nixon's Vietnamization.
It shows how vulnerable even powerful democracies can be in these long wars if they lose public consent. You need that internal cohesion.
Okay, so Vietnam is finally unified in 1975. But peace doesn't really arrive, does it? New conflicts erupt pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's quite striking. The end of the war against the U.S. didn't mean regional stability. Almost immediately, Vietnam gets drawn into new conflicts.
Why? What was the context there?
Well, you have long-standing historical suspicion between Vietnam and China. Vietnam was now allied with the Soviet Union, China's rival.
And then Cambodia.
In Cambodia, ruled by the Khmer Rouge, who were backed by China, Vietnam saw them as hostile. When Vietnam invaded Cambodia, China hit back.
So one war ends, but it creates new power vacuums, new tensions.
Exactly. Vietnam goes from fighting for its own independence to trying to assert influence in the region and facing new threats.
Let's unpack the Cambodian-Vietnamese War first. Started around 1978.
Yeah, late 78. But the tensions have been building for years. Even though they were once allies against the U.S., there was deep resentment and suspicion between the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese communists.
What were the Khmer Rouge worried about?
They feared Vietnam wanted to create an Indo-Chinese federation dominated by Hanoi. Old historical anxieties about Vietnamese dominance. Plus, the Khmer Rouge had these irredentist ideas about reclaiming parts of the Mekong Delta in Vietnam.
So they were actually attacking Vietnam.
Repeatedly. Raids across the border, massacres of Vietnamese civilians in border areas, places like Ba Choc. Really brutal stuff.
And Vietnam saw the Khmer Rouges
as hostile, pro-China, and a direct threat. China was pouring weapons and advisors into Cambodia. By late 77, it was basically open warfare along the border.
So Vietnam decided to invade.
Full-scale invasion, December 25, 1978. Around 150,000 troops. They moved fast.
And they succeeded.
Militarily, yes. They quickly defeated the main Khmer Rouge forces, captured Phnom Penh by early January 79.
And crucially, stopped the genocide.
Yes. Their invasion effectively put an ultimate stop to the Cambodian genocide, where estimates are 1.2 to nearly 3 million people were killed by the Khmer Rouge, a horrific regime.
But Vietnam then occupied Cambodia.
For a decade. They installed a pro-Vietnamese government, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, which many saw as a puppet regime.
So Vietnam became internationally isolated.
Severely. Condemned by the UN, China, the U.S., ASEAN countries, faced economic sanctions. The Khmer Rouge remnants retreated to the Thai border and kept fighting a guerrilla war backed by China and Thailand.
How did that occupation end?
International pressure? The sheer economic cost for Vietnam? They started withdrawing troops in the 80s, fully out by September 1989. The whole conflict officially ended with the Paris Peace Agreements in 1991, restoring Cambodia's monarchy and multi-party system.
Okay, so while Vietnam is occupying Cambodia, China decides to invade Vietnam. The Sino-Vietnamese War, 1979.
Right, just weeks after Vietnam went into Cambodia, China called it a punitive lesson.
What were China's main reasons?
Several layers. Big picture. The rivalry with the Soviet Union. Vietnam had just signed a defense treaty with Moscow, which really angered Beijing.
Then the immediate trigger.
Vietnam overthrowing China's ally, the Khmer Rouge. China felt it had to respond to sort of police Vietnam and reassert its regional authority.
Any internal Chinese politics involved?
Likely, yes. Deng Xiaoping was consolidating power. Some analysts think he wanted to test the PLA, expose its weaknesses to push for modernization and sideline rivals. Maybe even show the U.S. he was serious about countering Soviet influence.
He visited the U.S. just before the invasion, right?
Yes, very calculated move. Deng visited the U.S., likely signaling his intentions, getting a sort of tacit okay, ensuring the Soviets wouldn't jump in. Playing the America card, as it's called.
So the war itself, how did it go?
Started February 17th, 1979. Massive Chinese force, maybe 220,000 troops, pushed across the border.
But it was short.
Only lasted about a month. China declared victory, said they'd taught Vietnam its lesson, and unilaterally withdrew by mid-March. No real border changes.
And the PLA's performance?
By most accounts, pretty bad. Our source uses terms like abysmal performance, humiliating ineptitude. They faced battle-hardened Vietnamese troops who knew the terrain. Lots of Chinese casualties, command issues, logistical problems.
So a military failure for China?
Militarily, yes, arguably, but strategically. Deng probably got what he wanted.
How?
He showed the limits of the Soviet-Vietnam Treaty. Moscow didn't directly intervene. He used the poor performance to push through major military reforms and promote loyal commanders. He asserted China's regional dominance, signaling they wouldn't tolerate challenges, and it solidified the Sino-U.S. alignment against the Soviets.
Fascinating. So battlefield results aren't the whole story in these kinds of limited geopolitical wars.
Not at all. Success can be about signaling, diplomacy, internal politics. China effectively policed Vietnam, even if their army didn't look great doing it.
And the impact on Vietnam?
Intensified their animosity towards China, obviously. Led to years of low-level border clashes. Huge casualties on both sides, maybe 30,000 dead each, though numbers are murky.
Okay, let's shift to the aftermath. The long-term legacies of all these decades of war. For Vietnam itself.
Just profound. The human cost, as we said, millions dead. That leaves scars on any society.
And the physical environment?
UXO, unexploded ordnance, still a danger in huge parts of the country. Agent Orange's legacy, birth defects, cancer, ecological damage, continues to this day.
What about the economy right after reunification?
Terrible shape. Attempts at Soviet-style collectivization in the South didn't work well, led to food shortages. U.S. trade embargoes hit hard, limited aid. Much of the country was devastated.
And politically, unification wasn't smooth sailing internally.
No. The Communist Party cemented its authority, for sure, but there was suppression of people associated with the old South Vietnamese regime. Re-education camps. Estimates range up to 1–2 million people sent there.
That must have caused huge resentment.
Fueled alienation, definitely, and led to the mass exodus of the boat people.
How many fled?
Around 1.1 million people in the decade or so after the war. Perilous journeys, many didn't survive. A significant number were ethnic Chinese, targeted as capitalists or potential enemies after the war with China.
Creating huge diaspora communities overseas.
Yes, in the U.S., Canada, Australia, France. And many in the diaspora remain quite critical of the government in Vietnam. There's still this sense of division, of silenced Southern narratives. Victory wasn't a simple thing for everyone.
And the impact on international relations. We touched on the U.S.
Yeah, the Vietnam War fundamentally changed America. Deep divisions at home, a total rethink of foreign policy, the Vietnam Syndrome. U.S. reputation took a big hit globally.
Losing to a smaller country must have been a shock to the system.
Huge impact on American self-image, military thinking. And the later conflicts, Cambodia, the China War, they reshaped regional alliances again.
Yeah.
Vietnam was very isolated for a while.
But that changed.
It did. And here's a crucial link. The resolution of the Cambodian conflict, combined with Vietnam's own severe economic problems.
Problems made worse by the occupation costs and isolation.
Exactly. All that international pressure and economic hardship directly led Vietnam to implement the Hanoi renovation reforms in 1986.
Ah, the market reform.
Yes, a major shift. Opening up the economy, moving towards market principles, improving foreign relations. That was the key to breaking the isolation.
Facilitated normalization with the U.S., China, joining ASEAN in '95.
Precisely. A pragmatic shift forced by adversity, moving away from Cold War dogma towards integration. And that laid the foundation for the economic growth Vietnam has seen since.
So wrapping this deep dive up, what are the main takeaways from this long, complex history of conflict?
Well, first, that incredible resilience born from centuries of resisting foreign powers. Second, the importance of adaptability in warfare, how Vietnam consistently found ways to counter stronger foes.
Third, the immense, enduring human and societal costs of all this conflict.
Absolutely. And finally, how those post-unification conflicts and the economic pressures they created ultimately pushed Vietnam towards major reforms and reshaped its place in the world.
It's an amazing, often tragic story. And understanding this history really does give you a much richer context for looking at Vietnam today, doesn't it?
Definitely. You see where that national identity comes from, why certain geopolitical sensitivities exist.
Okay, so a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Thinking about Vietnam's long experience navigating powerful neighbors, internal divisions, the aftermath of intervention, what lessons might that hold for other nations facing similar pressures today?
Yeah, is resilience always born from conflict?
Yeah.
What does it tell us about the limits of military power versus national will?
Something to ponder. It's certainly more complex than just winners and losers.
Absolutely. A lot to think about there.